Winter on behalf of the HHSC Office of Inspector General, and that you'll be testifying neutrally. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Great, thank you. And Ms. Biles, we show you registered as Susan Biles on behalf of the HHSC Office of the Inspector General, and that you'll be testifying neutrally. Is that correct?
Yes.
Great, thank you for being here.
Good
Thanks for
evening.
staying here.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I am Raymond Winter, the Inspector General for HHSC, and Ms. Biles is our Principal Deputy Inspector General. Thank you for the invitation to be with you tonight to talk a little bit about what we do at the Office of Inspector General. In the materials that we provided, the second page lists our vision and our mission, but quite simply, our mission in life is to safeguard the $50 billion in annual spend by the state of Texas on health and human services. The lion's share of that is Medicaid, which is 38 to 40 billion annually. And then there are other programs on top of that that account for the 50 billion plus, which includes the Women, Infant, and Children program, the SNAP program, TANF, CHIP, and others. And that includes both state and federal money. On the next slide after that, which is slide 3 in the package, you can see why our mission is important. National studies show that up to 10% of any state's expenditures on health and human services in any given year are lost due to waste, fraud, or abuse. The conduct that results in this loss runs the spectrum from innocent good faith disputes, mechanical errors, even mistakes on the part of the state on the one end, on the benign end of the spectrum, all the way on the malignant end of the spectrum to conduct that somebody engages in where they know or should have known better that they are injecting false information into the system that results in somebody getting a payment that they're not entitled to. So that 10% number in Texas amounts to $5 billion, give or take, every year that does not go where you all intended it to go, which is the theft to taxpayers. And it also means that our most vulnerable citizens are not getting the services that they need. On the next slide, you can see some information that relates to this big pot of money that's out there, this $50 billion. Medicaid is a public-private partnership. No one is compelled to be a Medicaid provider. They're all volunteers. The clients, of course, are entitled to the benefit if they meet the criteria. But on the provider end, they're volunteers, and they have an obligation to know and obey the requirements. And there's a quote at the left side of the slide from a Supreme Court case that talks about men must turn square corners when they deal with the government. And that's just reinforcing this notion that as a provider in this program, there's an obligation to obey the law. Just like we have to obey the law when we get on the highway. Nobody says we have to get a driver's license and drive, but we have to know the speed limit and obey the traffic rules. So participation is voluntary, but it's a huge pot of money. And human nature being what it is, there are always going to be people, as Ben Franklin observed back in the 1700s, that are going to take advantage of that. So that illustrates why our mission is so important to safeguard this money. On the next slide, you can see some aspects of our jurisdiction. We have jurisdiction over people. Those include Medicaid providers. Those include the clients. Those include retailers who participate in the Electronic Benefits Transfer Program, the SNAP program. They include our own employees and all the HHS employees at HHSC, the Department of State Health Services, the Department of Family and Protective Services, and here at OIG itself, and then all the programs that we've just mentioned. The next slide is a snapshot of our workforce. We are authorized a shade under 600 personnel who are located at about 25 locations throughout the state of Texas. And of course, we have our headquarters here in Austin. The next slide is a picture of some of the tools in our toolkit to do the job that we are tasked to accomplish. Our largest division includes our investigators who look into allegations of misconduct on both the client side as well as the provider side. We have a unit called BPI, which is a Beneficiary Program Integrity, and we have a unit called MPI, which is Medicaid Provider Integrity. And they do investigations. They're sleuths. They look into allegations of somebody doing something that constitutes misconduct, resulting in somebody getting a benefit that they're not entitled to. We have nurses who do clinical reviews of Medicaid claims data, retrospective reviews in hospital settings, in long-term care settings, and also acute care settings. We have peace officers who work in state-supported living centers and state hospitals for the most part. We have a few peace officers who do EBT investigations, and we have one who does Medicaid provider integrity investigations. We have auditors. There's been quite a bit of discussion about audits today, and we have our own set of auditors. They turn in about 34 audit reports annually. And they do audits of everything within the HHS structure. They do audits of other state operations within HHS. They do audits of providers. They do audits of our Medicaid managed care contractors. They do audits of LMHAs and LBHAs, which are local mental health authorities and local behavioral health authorities. And we have lawyers. We have a robust enforcement aspect to what we do, and part of my goal as the Inspector General is to make that even more robust and increase our operational tempo in the litigation area, holding those bad actors on the malicious end of the scale accountable. Under the statutes that we enforce, we have the capability of recovering $3 for every dollar that is lost due to the violation for those bad actors who are acting with knowledge of the misconduct that's taking place. All of our tools and all of our operations are driven by data analytics. We have a very strong and robust technology division with data analysts who are looking and working in the space of Medicaid claims data, looking retrospectively to see what has happened and looking forward to see if we can predict what might be happening. Medicaid integrity in the state of Texas and in HHS is a three-legged stool. Our operation, depicted here on the next slide, is the administrative piece of that. That's one leg of the stool. The Attorney General's office has the other two legs. They have the criminal enforcement capability, which is in the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. They do investigations of allegations of criminal misconduct and make referrals to the appropriate prosecuting authority. They also have a civil function where they can bring lawsuits against bad actors who are stealing money from the Medicaid program. I came from the civil side before I came to the OIG. I spent 24 years at the Attorney General's office prosecuting civil cases against Medicaid fraud bad actors. The red circle in the center of the slide is a representation of conduct. There can be conduct that a person is engaged in that could subject that person to a criminal investigation, a civil lawsuit, or an investigation by our office. And we continually coordinate, cooperate, communicate, and deconflict with the Office of the Attorney General as cases arise that may lend themselves to any one of these three different remedies. So we have an ongoing, robust collaboration effort with the OAG. The next slide talks about some of the different outcomes that can result from the administrative process. The red arrow at the top of the picture is where we do a preliminary investigation, which lasts about 45 days, and we may conclude there's nothing there. We're just going to close the file, and everybody's going to go on their merry way. It could also result in a intervention or an education letter, like a Dear Doctor letter. We found something that you were doing that is concerning, and we want you to go get some education, or a Dear Dentist letter, for example, something like that. We can put a provider on what is called a prepayment review. Before their claim is paid, it's subject to extra scrutiny. We can recoup overpayments. We have two primary statutes that are committed to us for our enforcement activities. One is Chapter 531 of the Texas Government Code, and it's soon to go to Chapter 544 in April of this year. And that gives us the authority, if we're looking at that spectrum again of conduct from the benign to the malicious, on the benign end of the scale, if somebody gets something that they weren't entitled to, but it was a good faith mistake, an error. It could even be a mistake or an error on the part of the state that paid the person. We're entitled to get that money back. That's an overpayment. And so we're entitled to go get that money back on the benign end of the scale, and that's governed by Chapter 531 of the Government Code. For those bad actors, though, the people that are acting with knowledge, the statute that we enforce is Chapter 32 of the Human Resources Code. And we'll talk a little bit about that, I think, as we go on. In fact, the next item on this slide, the red arrow going south, recovery of the overpayment is 531. Recovery of penalties is Chapter 32 of the Human Resources Code. And then we can also exclude a provider for committing misconduct under the program. I mentioned the data analytics. The next slide is a picture of an example of one of our data analytics exercises. These are behavioral health providers, and what you see clustered in the lower left end of the slide are all the blue dots, and those are the behaviors that we would expect from those providers. But the red dots moving to the right on the graph are outliers. Those are instances of claimants whose billing behavior is not consistent with where the bulk of the providers are, and they would have to be investigated by boots on the ground. This would not be something that would be the end-all. It's the starting point of an investigation that would merit further investigation by our investigators. So some of the common fraud schemes that we see in the Medicaid space are listed on the next slide, slide 11. Upcoding is they billed us for the Cadillac of services and they delivered the Yugo. They billed us for an expensive service and delivered, in actuality, a much less expensive service. That's upcoding. Unbundling is some services are included under umbrella codes that include a multitude of different individual items. Unbundling is a situation where they add an a la carte charge on top of the umbrella code. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, an example of that occurs in hospital settings from time to time that we've seen actually a fair amount of. Adding modifiers. Sometimes a provider will add a modifier to a claim to get it to go through the system. Sometimes their behavior demonstrates that they run it through the system and it gets denied, and they realize, okay, if I add this modifier on it, it's going to pass through and I'm going to get paid, which is evidence of the more malicious kind of misconduct on that end of the spectrum. We have occasions where providers bill us for services they never delivered at all. And we have occasions where we find that providers engage in impermissible coding activity in order to get claims paid. So the next slide, slide 12, talks a little bit about those preliminary investigations. On the left-hand side is a pie chart, which is representations of the preliminary investigations that we do. These are the 45-day initial look at the allegation. And if the investigators at that stage determine that there is sufficient evidence to refer the case to what we call a full-scale investigation, then that's on the right side of the graph, the pie chart. Those are typically completed within 180 days, but there are exceptions to the requirement that we complete that full scale within 180 days. If circumstances warrant, we can go longer. But this pie chart just kind of shows you some of the different kinds of investigations we've had. The next couple of slides go into greater detail on some of the kinds of investigations and allegations that we've investigated. I don't want to spend much time on that, but happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'd like to go now to slide 15, and these are some case examples of some of what we were talking about. Upcoding. These are what we call UA modifier cases. An example here is under certain home health scenarios, the attendant is in the home health agency is entitled to an enhanced, more expensive, higher reimbursement if the patient has a tracheotomy or a breathing disorder. What we find is sometimes they add a modifier on there to get the increased reimbursement, yet the underlying patient data does not reflect that the patient has a tracheotomy. So it's just a simple adding the modifier to get the higher reimbursement. We had a number of those cases that we resolved in the third quarter of 2024, almost $1.5 million recovered. The next slide, slide 16, is the one I talked about on bundling. In the emergency room, there's a thing called an evaluation and management code that is billed in the emergency room setting, and it includes the cost of giving an injection. We've had a number of different providers that have billed us the E&M code, but then tacked on an a la carte claim for the injection. It's quite simple, and it's impermissible. We recovered, settled a number of those cases also in the third quarter of last year at $1.8 million in similar scenarios that resulted in these recoveries. Over the last several years, our recoveries are north of $60 million in similar claims as these. The next slide, 17, pharmacy inventory investigations. These include things like a pharmacist will bill us for the branded drug that actually dispensed the less expensive generic drug. We've had situations where the pharmacist will bill us for a drug that our review of their inventory records reveals they never had at all. So it's really, they're billing us for the Cadillac, but they never even dispensed the Yugo. I mean, they didn't have that drug at all, and they're billing us for something they never carried on their shelf. We've had situations where the pharmacist has substituted their own judgment and billed us for an expensive drug that's not is what is written on the script. And then COVID test kits. Medicaid policies allowed the dispensing of up to 4 COVID test kits to a patient within a month, and that anything more than that has to be backed up by a prescription. We've got a number of investigations now with pharmacy providers that have allegedly provided us with false information, false prescriptions to justify dispensing in excess of 4 per month. Coding manipulation, I think I already discussed that one. The last slide in the backup in the materials that we've provided for you are our metrics for the last year. In fiscal year 24, we recovered $442 million for taxpayers. A big percentage of that was federal money and had to be tendered back to the federal government, but the balance was returned to Texas taxpayers. Our return on investment is $5.44 for every dollar invested in our operations. And that compares very favorably with similar operations in similar states. But we can do more and we can do better. One of our goals here at the Office of Inspector General is to increase our return of value for taxpayers, to increase that ROI, find more of those bad actors on the malicious end of the spectrum and hold them accountable, and where the facts and the evidence supports it, to get $3 back if we can for every dollar that's lost. So we're constantly looking for ways to improve our operations, and we certainly hope that the next time we report on ROI, it's a little bit higher than that. That concludes my prepared remarks, and we're happy to answer any questions you have.
Great. Members, any questions? Oh, okay, let me, Representative Tinderhold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this data. This is amazing. So I have to ask, as a business owner, there is a sweet spot somewhere, right? So if the return on investment is somewhere between $3 and $5, depending on how you look at it, you'd mentioned $3 at the end. You also mentioned $5 and something. How much, let me start first with, how much of the $442 million does the state actually retain percentage-wise? 20, 50%?
It's really probably in the range of about 35 or so. On the Medicaid space, the state-federal match is right now about 63-37.
Okay.
So, you still got 60-40, 60% going back to the feds.
So when an agency is bringing in money and catching fraud, have you ever done a study to look and see what the sweet spot is? If we doubled your FTEs, your full-time employees, if we tripled them, if we quadrupled, sometimes you have to spend money to make money or save money. So have you looked to see what you think you could do with, say, 25% more FTEs or 100% more FTEs, and whether we'd catch more fraud, and would we benefit taxpayers significantly if we were to do the opposite of what most people think we're here for? We invest and we save more. Is there a spot that you have looked at? Have you ever done a study on that or looked to see?
Thank you for that question, Representative Tinderhold. I don't think we have done a study per se in those terms. Like if you gave us, double the amount of personnel that we currently have, we could do X. We certainly have studied though, and from time to time have requested additional funding for additional troops, additional investigators, additional lawyers. In fact, there's discussions now. But Susan has been here longer than me, and she perhaps can give you some more institutional history on that.
I would agree with Ray. I don't think that we've ever studied it in the way that you're kind of talking about. That a lot of our work is personnel driven. If we're going to do claims reviews, I need a nurse to review the claims. There's also technology solutions that can help you be more efficient. So maybe you don't necessarily need an additional person, but if you had a tool, you can make the person that you already have.
Do you have
more
all the tools you need right now?
So I think last session we had several technology projects funded. We have a couple this session that I think would assist us in making more use of the FTEs that we have. But we've never looked at it like if you gave us 100 more people or 200 more people, what would that equate to? We've never really looked at it in that way.
Y'all might want to consider that because part of the role of this committee is to try to save taxpayer money and root out fraud, waste, and abuse. And you guys do all three of those: abuse, fraud, and waste. You guys do all three of them. And if you're doing $5 for every dollar spent, there's going to be a point where the $5 drops to $3, then it drops to $2, but where it evens off and where it levels out. And there's no way for us to know what that number is. You guys could probably best guesstimate, or maybe over the course of 3 or 4 sessions, you increase by 50 FTE, and you see eventually the lines come together and we've met about the right spot. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it might be something you guys consider looking at and asking the legislature for money and being able to show appropriations what your intent is with it. I'm going to spend money, but I'm going to bring in more money than what we spend. I wanted to bring that forward and kind of get people's minds to think differently than just, hey, where do we cut? Because sometimes we have to invest to get money back.
Okay. Representative Alders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, IG Winter, for hanging around all day. It's been a long one, but we want to take advantage of your time now to kind of follow up on a handful of things. And I do want to follow up on the slide deck that you had here, just for starters. So on the common fraud schemes that y'all uncover, how often are y'all uncovering upcoding and other types of fraud? Y'all track the number of times this occurs?
We don't have metrics, I don't believe, Senator, that looking at slide 11, that
Correct.
can say that 20% of the MPI cases are upcoding and 15% are unbundling or anything like that. I don't believe we keep those kind of metrics. I'm referring to my colleague Steve Johnson, sitting in the first row behind me, who is registered and is in charge of these operations. So if you hit me with a question that you stump me, I may ask him to come up here, but he's telling me I'm accurately answering your question. We don't keep those kind of metrics.
Okay. Are there consequences for those who would be committing this kind of fraud? I mean, who follows up on that to make sure that the same kind of, the person who's committing the fraud doesn't have the opportunity to just continue pulling that stunt?
Well, we do. Yes, sir, there are consequences, absolutely. This is the kind of conduct that I was talking about on the malicious end of the spectrum. We've got innocent mistakes, mechanical glitches, errors even by the state on the benign end of the spectrum. And then on the malicious end of the spectrum, we have people who are doing something where they're acting with knowledge. It may not be intent to commit a crime, but it's one step removed from that. And it's somebody acting with knowledge. In fact, the statute says that our burden is just to show they're acting with knowledge. We don't have to show that they intended to commit a crime, because these are not criminal actions. Ours are not. They're administrative actions. Mm-hmm. But if we prove that they had the knowledge to tell a lie that resulted in a loss, and the evidence supports what we put forward, then there are consequences. This is where we can get the $3 back for every dollar that's lost as a result of the violation, plus we can get additional administrative penalties, plus they're excluded from participation in the program
Okay.
for a period of time. Now, that's if we go all the way to the mat through adjudication. If there's an order, often these cases, 99% of the time, resolve with a settlement without going all the way through, to the final adjudication.
Okay, all right. I want to veer on to another topic that y'all didn't spend a lot of time on, but that is the SNAP benefits and out-of-state spending trends. What can you kind of summarize what y'all have seen over the years on users who will utilize those benefits across state lines, and kind of give us a little bit of the background on that?
I can take a crack at that, Representative, and if I screw it up, I think I've got my lifeline here from Mr. Johnson.
Perfect.
But I've got some numbers. So in out-of-state spending in the last year, fiscal year 24, we did 1,200 investigations into out-of-state spending, and we identified $4.3 million in overpayments that would be targeted for recovery. That's for the last year. I hope that is responsive to your question.
Yes. Now, did y'all pursue those funds in all 1,200 cases? What y'all identified those? How much of that can actually be recovered?
I'm going to have to call my lifeline on that.
I was going to say, a beneficiary can have up to 3 years to pay the money back. So we identified it in 24. It may come in over time, but in all of these cases where we've identified it, we've done the case, and the person has admitted guilt, and they will be paying the money back. It just may not all come in right at once. It comes in over time.
How often do y'all do those audits?
On the out of state, we get referrals on a regular basis from HHSC. They get a report, and then they look at, okay, if someone's been buying something out of state for a period, I think it's 2 months, over 2 months or more, then they send them over to us and say this person is probably not living in Texas, because you might go visit family or do something where you're buying something out of state, but someone who is consistently using their benefits out of state, either they're not living there or someone else is using their benefits. And so then we come in and do the investigation.
Okay. Is that a quarterly, report that they get biannually, every month? Do we know how often HHS
They kind of
is
come
getting
in
that?
waves to us, and so I don't know if they're looking at that monthly or quarterly. They're not coming to us necessarily on a regular basis, but they are monitoring and sending us referrals.
Okay. We've had conversations over the course of the day about software, utilization of software for tracking data as a state, as agencies. It's curious to me because we asked HHS to get us a report, an updated report on out-of-state spending on SNAP benefits, and it has not been fruitful. It's taken them a lot of time to get that information. It seems to me that our software systems that we have in the state, you ought to be able to produce that report and pull out the personal data that they want to make sure they protect, but they could produce that report in a short amount of time and allow us to actually audit and see what they're finding. We've also looked at this based on information from HHS. They have the ability, HHSC has the ability to use immigration status to determine eligibility, but they don't have to. Do we know if that is a metric that they are using to gather on each applicant?
It's my understanding they do check that routinely.
Consistently?
And pretty consistently. We had in our BPI, our Beneficiary Program Integrity Unit, which investigates allegations of client misconduct, which would include somebody misrepresenting their immigration status. In the last year, we had 16,000 investigations on the BPI side. Only 100 of them included allegations of an illegal alien obtaining benefits impermissibly, and 49 of those actually panned out and
Okay.
resulted in findings.
Okay. That's perfect. I appreciate that. Similar question here, and I don't know if this is. I'll just ask anyway. So my understanding is there's 30,000-ish employees at HHSC. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I think it may be more than that now, but it's in that neighborhood.
Okay, 30,000 plus. Where are all those employees located around the state? Are they working from home? Do we have an idea of the status
I mean,
of
I think
those
we'd have to
employees?
defer to HHSC on
Okay.
who works
Yeah.
at home or not, but a large percentage of them, I want to say 20,000 possibly, work in state-supported living centers and state hospitals and provide direct care. So
Okay.
they're coming in. And then they have around 9,000 are their access and eligibility workers who are enrolling the clients. And they have a mix of being in the office and being able to work from home, but they have some guidelines about working for the state for at least a year,
Okay.
meeting your metrics, showing that you're a good employee. And then in terms of everyone else, I would definitely have to defer to HHSC.
Yeah, since we didn't have them here, I figured I'd ask the Inspector General and see if we can get a little bit of feedback on that. Then the final question I have is related to the renewal process for benefits. My understanding is that this is an automated renewal process at the federal level. It's just every applicant is auto-renewed. Is that correct?
No, sir, not exactly. It's a little more nuanced than that.
Okay.
So CMS imposes requirements on the state. CMS at the federal level, they don't do it themselves. So there are certain requirements imposed on the states for renewals that are slightly different for Medicaid than they are for SNAP, for example. So for, let me see if I got this, if I wrote this down right. On Medicaid side, there is a government-initiated renewal process, whereas on the SNAP side, it's reverse. It's the client-initiated renewal.
So
And
it's the federal requirement
Right.
on Medicaid that you check certain data sources. If there's no change in what the client had previously reported, they send a letter to the client, say, has anything changed? And the client says yes or no, and then they can be renewed. On the SNAP side, the client has to initiate the renewal.
Okay. So the larger program is going to be the one that's auto-renewed. That's the Medicaid side, right?
subject to checks. There are checks and balances.
Correct.
It's not just an automatic renewal.
If they're utilizing the benefits.
Yes.
Well, they're checking, like with TWC, does their income look the same as what they reported before?
Right.
Those, like, they're checking certain data sources to ensure that the person would still qualify, and then they check with the client.
Just from your perspective, I mean, do you think that's the ideal way in which that should be implemented, or do you think the onus should be on the applicant to make sure that they're the ones who are saying, yes, we need, income levels have not changed, we need these benefits to be renewed, and that responsibility is on them?
I'm not sure that they were qualified to answer that question. We're sort of in the police the system and make sure the dollars don't get away and aren't used impermissibly. I'm not sure if I have a better answer for you on that. Do you?
No, I would agree. I think the important thing to us is that checks are made and that you're verifying that what the client is telling you is correct. Is, I think, from the program integrity perspective. With it being a federal requirement, I don't know that HHSC has flexibility in that space, but
Sure.
I agree with Ray that I don't know that either of us are
That's fine.
qualified to comment.
I did think of a follow-up, though. This is implemented, and you have a multitude of participants. There's how many of those participate through the app?
It's my understanding that north of 60% of the clients use the My Texas Benefits app that they can download on their phone.
Do you know if there's any verification that is pushed to those participants?
It is my understanding there is not currently.
Okay. It seems to me that that would be something that, I mean, we all utilize technology every day, and I mean, I think we're all constantly, faced with, is it truly you? Is it, are you trying to access this software or this website? I think that seems to me like that would be a good way to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse if you had that verification tool.
Yes, sir, we agree with that. There are a couple of different scenarios where we think it would be useful. PIN changes, for example, on the SNAP card, the clients, of course, are entitled to change the PIN, and they just have to have a passcode and call in and make a phone call and get the PIN changed. If there was a push to the app, there could be a verification process. We've probably all experienced this. If there's an expenditure on a credit card out of state, we may get a call from Visa saying, hey, is this you or you in New York City? So, yes, if there's a PIN change or if there's expenditures out of state, for example, are two scenarios where a push to the client asking them to verify that would be probably useful and save money.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Can we do that? What we were just talking about? I mean, who has to? Is that our app?
We have it's my understanding that we on the HHSC side administer and own the application. What their restrictions are on whether they could employ that kind of a check and balance, I don't know. I don't know, for example, with the SNAP benefit, they would have to, I presume they would have to check with the federal government to see if that would be something allowed. I just don't know the answer to that.
Okay, maybe we can find that out. Representative Rodriguez Ramos.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at your PowerPoint, your presentation, and the what was it? Where the Baylor, Scott, and White, the $1.2 million in funds in 2023, in addition to settlements reached with the DFW area hospital system in Southeast Texas, totaling more than $1.8 million in funds, whatever they were. I'm not sure what category they were, but it sounds like HHSC is bleeding money, and a lot of what you talked about is recovery. So what are some tools or what is the process to be proactive, or do you guys play any part or provide any recommendations as you're doing your investigations? We want to prevent this and not have to go recoup money. And so what are some conversations or what is the process on how to work with HHSC so that we could prevent the having to recover versus, the money being wasted?
Yes, ma'am. Great question. It's sort of similar to the conversation that we just had with respect to the My Texas Benefit application on the client side. And on the Medicaid provider side, which you're speaking to right now, we have a robust line of communication with our partners at HHSC where we make suggestions and recommendations to them, shoring up contractual language with MCOs, for example, from time to time. The law of the state of Texas is the Health and Human Services Commission. Chief Counsel is the ultimate decider of what is the policy in the state of Texas and policy interpretations. So we constantly, when we find things that we think rise to the level of being misconduct, we have to have an ongoing dialogue with HHSC to make sure they agree with us on interpretation of the policy. But it boils down to, though, pay and chase. This is a pay and chase system. As I pointed out in the original presentation, it depends upon providers and government actors all participating honestly and in good faith. Clients too. Everybody's supposed to be telling the truth. Nobody's supposed to be trying to get more than they're entitled to. And to build a Fort Knox of a system, I use the analogy of a barn and cattle getting rustled out of the barn, or dollars that are getting diverted to where they're not supposed to go. So you could build a barn that is secure as Fort Knox, but it would be extremely cumbersome. That's my understanding of all the thought that has gone into the policy over the years. It would be very, very cumbersome, and lives hang in the balance. We've got people who need
Right.
Medicaid benefits. They
Right.
need SNAP benefits. The most vulnerable of our citizens who depend upon these HHS services. And so it is by design a pay and chase system. It depends upon people acting honestly and in good faith on all sides, clients, the state, the providers, to get these services to the people that they need. But then we're here to, sort of watch those cows as they're getting out, and if they're getting rustled, then that's our job, is to chase down the cattle rustlers. From time to time, we'll see something in the barn, and we'll go to Medicaid program, and we'll say, hey, you got a hole in the barn there. You can hammer a board over that hole in the barn, and maybe you're not going to lose so many cows. We have that kind of a conversation with them from time to time, but it's a tension. There's a tension between getting the benefits out the door to these people who are so
Right.
at risk, and that depends upon this expectation of good faith, honesty, transparency, versus holding them accountable, holding everybody accountable, all the participants in this program accountable, and holding them strictly accountable to the extent that when they're really committing misconduct that they know is something that they've injected into the system that's a lie, well, then we can get $3 back, plus additional penalties, plus we can exclude them.
Right.
So it's a challenge, and it's a great question. Could you build a barn that is so secure that no dollars ever escape in the first place? And it's
Understood. Talk to me about the, on your, it says results. What is it, what do you mean by cost avoidance? And then, if you can explain that, and then client investigations, what does that look like? That's on your slide 19.
slide 19.
Yes, sir.
And I'm sorry, your specific question was which?
If you can explain to me the cost avoidance, the 189, and the 16,000 client investigations.
So the 16,000 client investigations are on the beneficiary side, and that was the statistic I referred to a moment ago. We had 16,000 investigations on the client side. 100 of them involved allegations that the client was not a U.S. citizen.
But it was not specific like this person, but it was all of these people are not U.S. citizens, and that's how it was categorized?
So 16,000 are our clients. Those are 16,000 basically individuals.
So if somebody called on each one of those 16,000 people.
We get referrals from Access and Eligibility Services at HHSC, which is enrolling clients. Part of
Okay.
their due diligence on the front end is to check immigration status and to check incomes and to check and see if the beneficiary qualifies. And they do checks on the Texas Workforce Commission website and tax rolls and everything else. So they're enrolling people, and then they'll send us tips
Got
of
it.
something didn't check out. So out of
Okay.
those 16,000 investigations in the last year, most of them fall into one of two buckets. It's either household composition or income. So basically, I come into the state and I say, I qualify, I meet the income threshold, and I'm misrepresenting that my wife is actually in the house and contributing to the income. I'm also misrepresenting the fact that I have a well-paying job that also bumps me over the income threshold. So most of those 16,000 investigations fall into one of those two buckets.
Okay.
The 189 million in cost avoidance, those are the places where we've suggested to HHSC that you ought to hammer a nail over that hole in the barn. And,
Okay.
and I think we've got a couple of examples.
Sure.
Of this.
So the vast majority of that money is when we've stopped a payment from going out the door before it's
Okay.
been paid. So we've avoided spending the money. We also have a program that we call the lock-in program. So if you're a client who has a history of drug abuse, you can be locked into a single pharmacy, a single doctor, so that you can't shop around for additional prescriptions or things like that. And we will look at what did we spend on that client for the year before, and then what are we spending on that client on the year after. And there's a calculation involved on all of the clients to kind of come up with a number. but it's looking at what were we spending before, what are we spending now? So we avoided the higher costs when that person was more easily abusing
Oh, interesting.
than in the post. So it's things like that where the state has avoided outlaying the money. So it's not the pay and chase, it's the money never went out the door.
Wonderful. And last question, there was talk about out-of-state fraud. I did have a constituent not too long ago whose card was being used out of state, but they weren't ever out of state, and I guess maybe because of the facility on how to make, maybe somebody's making copies of cards out of state, or there's some fraud. Could you speak to that? Because from my understanding, that is not an uncommon, or that has, it's, I don't want to say not uncommon, but there are individuals who are facing their cards information being stolen and spent out of state when that individual has never left. And so could you speak a little bit about those types of cases?
Yes, ma'am. We have a whole team that reports to Steve, the gentleman behind me, that does electronic benefit transfer investigations. And there are both external and, unfortunately, internal threats to that integrity of that program. The external threats include skimming devices on a retailer. You go to swipe your card, and these are like a credit card, and unfortunately, they don't have a chip. That's another cost measure that perhaps could be considered on the SNAP card. And again, the federal government would, I don't know what they would have to say about that, whether or not HHSC could put a chip on the card. But that would also, we think, go a long way to improving the integrity. But right now, they just have the magnetic strip. And
Right.
the magnetic strip can be subject to a hijacking device, a skimming device. And we have investigated allegations in many instances where, somebody lives in Austin, Texas, and the card gets skimmed and the purchases are in New York.
Yeah.
And they're being delivered to Florida. I mean,
Right.
we've got crazy things like that, and that's
Wow.
clearly somebody hijacking the benefit. We've got situations where retailers, think of a food truck, for example. The proprietor of the food truck wants to stock his food truck with Red Bull and Coca-Cola and brisket to make brisket tacos. He'll go to the clients, go to Susan and me and say, hey, you guys both have $500 each on your SNAP card. I'll give you $250 cash each.
Right.
And so that's something that's attractive to us because we need the cash to make our rent payment or whatever. So he pays $500 total, but now he's got $1,000 worth of SNAP benefits on these SNAP cards. And they go into retailers, they go into Costco, they go into Sam's Club, they go into whatever, and they'll lay out 10 or 15 different SNAP cards
Oh, wow.
and go stock the food truck. So things like that happen.
Wow.
That's an external threat. Not necessarily an out-of-state, but it could cross state lines.
Yeah.
Certainly could. The internal threat is, unfortunately, there's been some press about this recently about some instances of some of the AES employees
Right,
who
right.
have access to this information because of in the course and scope of their job duties. They need access to the information about the client. But unfortunately, there have been a number who have been alleged to have committed misconduct, committed crimes, by using the information they have access to criminally to hijack the benefit. We've investigated a number of those. We've referred 4 to district attorney's offices for criminal prosecution. A number of other individuals have been fired. And we have
Wow.
ongoing investigations.
That's great information. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Representative Olcott.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Winter, that's a perfect segue into my first question because I'm also in public health, and this actually issued the internal threat you just talked about came up this past Monday, where like 61,000 Texans' private information was accessed by some employees at HHSC. And I was actually inquiring about like what are the consequences of that, and they actually said they referred to the Inspector General's office. So it's nice. 2 days later, I get to see the man that's actually behind that. It sounds like you're doing a great job. One of the questions I asked them, and they weren't really sure, and I think they said it's best to talk to you, so I'm getting ready to ask you. Do you feel like, do you want to maybe expand on that a little bit, what happened? Because I understand it was like 61,000 people, and there's been a total of 9 that have been caught doing this. Is that right in this case? between June of 21 and December of 24? Is this when it occurred?
The number's more than 9.
Okay.
We have a number of investigations ongoing. I think the current information is we've referred 4. Steve, again, Steve is the guy who has a lot of our staff. He's got our investigators, he's got our peace officers, and he's got the folks who do these investigations. We've got peace officers who do criminal investigations in this area. We also have an internal affairs unit that also reports to Steve that does investigations just of the policy violations and the misconduct. So the number I can tell you is more than 9.
Okay.
We've referred 4 where we sustained the criminal allegations based on our investigation, and we've now referred them to the district attorney's office. Harris County, I believe, has got a couple of these, in Dallas County as well. So I'm about 1,000 here. Steve keeps nodding at me, so he's
Sure. Well, one of my
sparing-
questions that maybe you can answer is I want to know, like, do you feel like there's sufficient tools and, I mean, penalties? Are the penalties, I was going to ask, is it only civil, but it sounds like you're referring to criminal, right?
Yes, sir.
They're going to be prosecuted criminally, which I think is very appropriate. Have you had, I know none of us are probably lawyers, but have you had a chance to look at the statutes? Do you feel like in the penal code or wherever you look, do you think that they have the ability to prosecute harshly enough to where it's going to discourage it from happening again? I mean, do you have any opinion on that?
Yes, sir. I think the sanctions are there. These are felonies, as I understand it. Again, I'm
Like, what's the maximum
Depend on the dollar
these
amount?
people can serve if they're found guilty?
I'm sorry.
Do you know what the maximum penalty is if they're found guilty of literally taking people's private information and use it fraudulently like that?
I'm going to call my lifeline now.
Okay.
That's what you think. Hold on one second.
Steve Johnson.
What is your name? What is
Steve Johnson.
Okay. All right. Mr. Johnson, we show you registered as Steve Johnson on behalf of the HHSC Office of Inspector General, and that you'll be testifying neutrally. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. You're free.
Yeah, I was actually updated by the director in charge of this team just yesterday, who told me that we're about to get one of them. One of them in Dallas is about to go for indictment. They were talking to the district attorney there, or somebody in the district attorney's office, and they had planned on filing 3 felony charges, and one of them will be a first-degree felony based upon the privacy issue, based
Sure.
upon the misuse of the privacy. But of course, under the penal code, the determination of the amount of the felony is the determination of the amount of money. But we do have, I think there's one of these cases, I believe there was a total of nearly $80,000 that an individual was able to
Through one
transfer
card, or
themselves.
was he through multiple cards?
Multiple cards.
Okay,
And-
so
and
he
I-
was able to fraudulently expend $80,000.
Correct.
And that does sound like a serious felony.
And I did want to, just as far as on the scale of the numbers, just to be clear on the 66,000. The 66,000 was the number of accounts that they were concerned could have been accessed. That's the number of clients that HHSC contacted and say, we think your information might have been compromised. We're going to give you some free credit reporting. We're going to do some other
Right.
things
So it's
for
not
you.
necessary. I had 61,000, but it's not necessarily the case.
Right.
You think that up to that many could be affected.
So a subset of those will be the number of accounts that the person or that there was a PIN change on, and then a subset of those will be a number of accounts that they changed the PIN on and got money out of. And I don't have those numbers, but that's how it will sort of scale down.
Okay, thank you. Another question I had was that, at least according to a Texas Tribune article back on February 3rd, when asked, it sounded like at least the employees for HHSC that work from, that handle the applications, 40% of them work from home. And I want to know what your opinion on that is, because that does seem like if you were going to think along those lines, it would be much easier to think along those lines if you were at home and you had the access to the information, you can write down information. If you were at a work setting, it might be a little more difficult. Is it economically feasible for the state, for the people that handle the applications, to be actually working from a facility, a state facility, rather than from home? What are your thoughts on that? And what are you doing to actually prevent this from happening in the future? I mean, obviously, hopefully, if this message gets out to the other employees, they're going to be less likely to do it. But
I'll address the latter question first, if I can.
Okay.
Representative, the
Sure.
executive commissioner and I both jointly did a public service announcement to all the employees at HHSC about this very issue. We have reinforced, and I know the executive commissioner takes this very, very seriously, is very concerned about it. HHSC is doing internal reviews to better safeguard the system, to ensure employ appropriate checks and balances to try to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And that includes things like screening the employees on the front end, the new hires, as well as safeguards and checks and balances regarding the access to the information. But we have done a public service announcement jointly to the entire workforce about this issue, and warning folks that we are investigating all these allegations, which could result in a referral for criminal prosecution, a felony conviction, and certainly even short of that, it can result in somebody losing their job. In fact, a number of people have lost their jobs.
Sure. And I think losing your job, that's the right thing to do, but I can tell you that if some of these people that get charged with felonies and actually go to jail, there's probably nothing that sends a more powerful message, because you don't just lose your job, you can go to jail if you do something like that. So I think that's probably one of the best things could happen. I want to get back to Representative Tinnerholt's question to you about one of the reasons I like serving on this committee is that we're obviously almost everyone up here is looking for ways of cutting spending, but I would agree with him that if it's something that your office had more money, if you can actually recover, easily, it's a return on your investment, and that you haven't done a study, it sounds like. But are you prepared to actually, within the next week or so, actually think about maybe how much more money you would like for your office if you think that actually you feel pretty confident that would be a net return on investment for the state of Texas?
Well, we've certainly given thought to that question, not necessarily in the terms of the way the question was framed by Representative Tinnerholt, but we have given a lot of thought to that question of if we had more money in key areas, could we increase our ROI? And could we bring more value back to the citizens of Texas? We thought about that question quite a bit, and we've identified some areas where we think we need some targeted increases in our staff.
Sure.
I mentioned that I came from the Attorney General's office, so I'm an enforcement-minded guy. I'm not a numbers guy, but I'm an enforcement-minded guy.
You probably have people in your department that are numbers guys that could
Yes,
probably
sir,
give you
I
the
do.
answer to that.
Fortunately, in lifelines that can bail me out when y'all ask me tough questions. But I do know this, that our enforcement actions, particularly the ones that are targeted at those bad actors, not talking about the people signing in the wrong ink or using the wrong wrench or making an innocent mistake or a good faith dispute. I'm not talking about ticky-tacky things like that. I'm talking about the bad actors that know or should know better. For those folks, we can do a better job holding them accountable, finding more of those bad actors, because I think they're stealing more of the money. The 10% figure that I gave is in an array of many, many studies nationally that go from 5% up to 25% of any state's expenditures is lost due to waste, fraud, and abuse, which covers the waterfront.
Sure.
But our enforcement actions, just so using 10% is kind of a sort of a happy medium in the middle, the $5 billion. When we hold those bad actors accountable and we get those $3 back, it's like you said about the felony. When we hold that bad actor accountable and get $3 back for every dollar that was lost due to his violations, plus an additional administrative penalty for every instance of violation, plus he's excluded, we're accomplishing three things. We're getting Texas taxpayers, making them whole, in fact, making them 3 times whole. Mm-hmm. So we're putting money back into the system so that the most people that are the most at risk are getting more of the benefits that they're entitled to, and taxpayers are getting value. We're punishing the bad actor, and we're deterring future misconduct.
Yeah, deterrent.
So among the things that we think that will help us do our job better is more lawyers. If we had more lawyers, then we could chase down more cattle rustlers and get 3 cows back for every dollar for every cow that's stolen.
Yeah. When did you begin working for the Inspector General? Were you here 6 or 8 years ago?
No, sir. I was at the
Okay.
AG then. I came over to the OIG in June of 23, and then came into this position in October of 23.
I'm going to ask Chairman Carpiglione if he remembers this. I remember following a bill that former Representative Matt Schaefer had about 6 or 8 years ago, and it was actually having to do with the Lone Star card. And what he wanted to do was to have something on the back of the card that said something like fraud hotline and give the 1-800 number to, I'm assuming y'all have a hotline or something
Yes,
like
sir.
that, and to actually put it on the card and have the word fraud on the card, which I thought was a brilliant idea, simply because anyone wanting to commit fraud with that, if they were using a fraud and they know it, they're knowingly, doing it in the wrong way, that's going to be a little reminder when they go to that convenience store or the Walmart or the Costco to buy things. Even though they're not going to be calling the 1-800 number, it would be a little reminder. And I don't think that bill passed. Do you remember that, Chairman?
I don't remember that bill. We
Okay.
can look it up, but,
But anyway, I'm just wondering if that's something that needs to be reconsidered if it didn't pass. Is that something that you think would be somewhat effective? Maybe not as effective as some of the things you're really doing, but that just one more tool, one more deterrent.
I think one more deterrent is always a good idea. Personally, I think anything that we can do to get the word out on the street, and but then also I don't think anything speaks as loudly as the example.
Yeah,
So as
absolutely.
we
There's
hold
nothing.
those-
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
awesome. There's still 9 days left in the filing deadline.
Yep.
So if you have any good ideas. All right, I'm on Representative Curry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, thank all of you for what you're doing and for protecting the state of Texas and our federal dollars as well. And more importantly, thank you for staying. I'm sorry that you had to stay away from your families tonight to be able to do this, but it is vitally important to all of us. So we appreciate your sacrifice. We signed up for this. You got us to come in here, so thank you. I do want to get into a couple things. Mr. Johnson, I'm going to start with you now that he's got you at the table. So I was in the hearing aid business for a long, long time. I stayed away from Medicaid and kept all my people away from it because I didn't appreciate the program very well. I didn't like the fraud that existed in it. So we just didn't do it. But the reality is if I remember correctly, most of those charges were federal. And you had at least it seemed then that you had the ability to charge them federally and get them prosecuted through the federal system, which was year for year, dollar for dollar, day for day, all that, those kinds of things. But has that changed? So now you have to go through local DAs?
I don't know on particular hearing aids. Do you know if that might have been Medicare?
It was Medicaid.
Oh, it was Medicaid.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We shop our cases to the federal authorities. Most of our criminal referrals go through the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit at the Attorney General's office, and they work with both federal prosecutors and state prosecutors. We do have one Medicaid law enforcement officer down in the valley that's hooked up into a task force down there that works more or less exclusively with federal authorities. So I think that's still a pathway open to us, is to have our cases go into the federal criminal system.
Okay. I'd like to know that. I mean, I'd like to know if there's some prohibition or some change that's occurred, because typically, I would say depending on the venue you're in and depending on where you are, but that's certainly a much more serious problem, no matter who it is, if they're dealing with a federal charge versus a state charge.
Absolutely.
And so I would like to know if there's been a change in that program of any kind.
I mean, I've spoken with and worked with federal prosecutors in the Southern District in Houston within the last year to 2 years specifically on cases. Those were pharmacy cases, but they were Medicaid pharmacy cases. So yes, I would say that Medicaid criminal prosecution in the federal system is alive and well.
Okay. So thank you. Mr. Winters, I want to ask about look, you keep talking about a 3-to-1. When you tell me 5.4 to 1, 5.44 to 1, that's an ROI to me. And I think this goes back to Mr. Tenderholt, to a lot of our questions, is if we invested more, obviously, what would we get for it? And is there a balance point in there somewhere? So I do think a study of some form is warranted. I think a week may be a little bit of a short time, but at least in my world, even that's a short time. But do y'all have a reward program, like a Crime Stoppers type reward program for people who turn in fraud and turn in waste?
Yes, sir. The Chapter 531 of the Government Code, and I believe it's 531.101 is the provision, but we'll have to double check that and make sure I'm accurate. I'm doing that from memory. provides that the executive commissioner at HHSC may, in her discretion, award up to 5% of any penalty that we recover via our penalty statute, which is Chapter 32 of the Human Resources Code, that results in an assessment of penalties. So if we get a whistleblower tip and we bring an action under Chapter 32 chasing down one of those cattle rustlers, and we get $100,000 back, then the provision in 531.101 of the government code says that whistleblower can ask for an award, and that the executive commissioner may, in her discretion, award up to 5%. Now, to my knowledge, that's never, ever been utilized. It's never been worked. It's a little ungainly because you got to toggle between two different statutes. 531.101 has the award provision, but you got to get the recovery under Chapter 32 of the Human Resources Code. And it also pales in comparison to the statute that the Attorney General has on the civil side, which is Chapter 36 of the Human Resources Code, which includes an award for a whistleblower or relator who brings a successful case.
So I'm kind of thinking more in terms of a Crime Stopper type program where there's a $2,000, $3,000 rewards, whatever it is. But the reason I say that, and they're usually, I've used them in my different businesses at different times, and they've been extremely effective in people turning on people that they know they're doing something wrong, especially when they're the ones paying their taxpayer dollars into this. So thank you for that. I'll verify the codes. You don't have to come back to me on that, but I want to take that thought further in other agencies, other situations as well, and I think we may want to consider it, maybe expanding that in a situation like yours. So that takes me to the next subject, is that, it sounds like with and your site, reporttexasfraud.com, obviously you have that, and I think Representative Alcott's suggestion to go back and look at the possibility of advertising that maybe a little more widely and getting it on the back of the cards and doing some things that are critical. But I also think that based upon the investigations, just the few that you've told us about and the ones where you've told us about these, would you agree that if you had the ability to use artificial intelligence to go out and watch all of these things, whether it's the pharmacies issuing multiple drugs or a particular series of transactions that were occurring on multiple SNAP cards at one spot, at one location, in one register, at one time, and so on and so forth, where again, artificial intelligence can go look at data and then come back to your department and say, hey, and by the way, you can also use AI to be able to narrow that down to say, to get it to a spot to where it's manageable at a human level. Would you agree that would be maybe a good use of money, or certainly something that's worth studying to take to the next level, to give y'all more access to your 5.44 ROI?
Short answer is yes, sir, I think so. We have a robust data analytics team. One of our colleagues who can speak much more eloquently about all things data analytics, including AI, a wonderful member of our team, very conversant in that area. She sits on the AI committees that are studying the use of AI across the state agencies. And we use robust analytical tools to both look at what has happened and also to look in the future to try to, based upon past events and past conduct, can we apply these tools and do predictive analyses. And my understanding is that includes AI, but I'm going to see if either one of my lifelines here can better address that.
So I would say we're more in the traditional analytics right now.
Okay.
I think, there's a slide in here that kind of demonstrates where we've got algorithms that we're running that will identify someone for us. Where we'd like to be is to be able to look at all Medicaid data and build something that will say, hey, we're seeing this spike in behavior of billing of this code, or this behavior, this provider's, billing differently than everyone else, where we're not having to build the algorithm and go and look, that we have a system that tells us, and there's a piece, AI is a piece of that. And so we do have an exceptional item this session to get some tools that will help us build those
good.
tools. And better
Good. That's
tools.
really good to know. Would you mind sending me the contact information when you get a chance to the lady that you're speaking about?
Yes, sir.
Absolutely, we'd be happy to bring her by.
Yeah,
She would
please
love
do.
it.
Yeah, well, we would too. So thank you very much. And that's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for.
Thank you. Representative Bowers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. My questions have to do with HHSC, the OIG, and our veterans. And so I have a constituent that has not been to the doctor and cannot go under any kind of insurance since December. And he is a veteran, 22 plus years, Gulf War veteran. And so my series of questions are, what steps are being taken to improve communication and coordination between the VA, the Social Security Administration, and HHSC to ensure a seamless transition for veterans enrolling in Medicare Part B? Because that's really been where the problem and issue is for him.
So I would say that's a HHSC question, not OIG question. They do have a veterans program there, and the Texas Veterans Commission also tries to help veterans with their benefits as well. So that might be two resources, but it's not an area that we work in.
So would it not address interagency coordination?
Well, it would be coordination with kind of HHSC proper. We're administratively attached to them, but have separate function. And so it's an HHSC, big HHSC question versus OIG question, I think.
And I think you may be right. I just do want to know, let me ask you this then. Are there any identified bottlenecks or inefficiencies in the current system that hinder veterans' timely access to Medicare Part B benefits? And I'm hoping to identify systemic problems here. So I'm just trying to figure out, and I know that it's easy to put it off on another agency, but I'm trying to figure out for this constituent how they can get back to the doctor. And this is a 23-year veteran that cannot get services.
Well, I mean, we're happy to visit with HHSC and have them connected with you.
Sure.
Medicare is federal and is not under the purview of HHSC or of us. But I'm sure that there are people who can help facilitate that.
Well,
So we're happy to work with them and make sure we get the right people
if you
connected.
could send me that, because he has contacted his congressperson, because he is having a very hard time getting into the system. He, has to be taking Social Security as well to get enrolled in it. And I think there is some kind of transitional disconnect when it comes to getting our veterans that information and getting them enrolled in a timely manner. So if you can connect me with the proper persons to direct that constituent to, I would love that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Members, any other questions? All right, Representative Alders.
I just want to follow up on one final note, which is kind of what we can take as some areas where we can clean things up or make sure we have securities built in as we move forward or try to move forward. One thing y'all mentioned was the PIN updates on the online app, which the state, that would be HHSC under their purview since we run that app. Is that correct?
Are we talking about the My Texas Benefits application
Correct.
to implement? Yes, sir.
And then on the chip card or the SNAP card front, an implementation of a chip, that's a federal question.
I think
Potentially.
we'd would want to start with HHSC
Okay.
first, because even though it's federal dollars that are the benefits on the SNAP card, it's administered through HHSC.
Right.
So I don't know the
Okay.
answer as to whether or not HHSC can unilaterally put the chip in
Right.
or use the multi-factor authentication process without getting some kind of permission from the federal government.
Okay, that's fantastic. That's what I needed to know. My question going forward, just to wrap up and put a bow on this, is federal dollars are flowing through the states to implement these programs. What else, just pulling back, big picture, what else can the federal government be doing and implementing to make sure that we're avoiding waste, fraud, and abuse in these programs?
I've got two.
We got a bunch.
One of mine may also be Steve's, but one of the issues that we have is for client investigations only being able to criminally pursue Medicaid dollars. On SNAP, you can do it administratively. And so that really limits what we can recover in the Medicaid space, because you have to have a rather large case, especially if you're in an urban area, for there to be any interest from your local district attorneys to be able to prosecute those cases. And so that would be one change that would be needed at the federal level. And then the other one is a passion project of Steve's, so I won't steal your thunder. I'll let you talk about it.
So one of my interests is really not something that's core to our work, but it had to do with multi-state enrollees. And the Congress has spent some time talking about multi-state enrollees. So these are individuals that are enrolled in Medicaid and possibly SNAP and other benefits in multiple states at the same time. So on the SNAP side, I typically think of that as probably intentional wrongdoing, because if they're intentionally getting a SNAP card from 2 different states or SNAP benefits from 2 different states at the same time, that's intentional, and that's probably criminal and wrong. On the Medicaid side, it could very well be that, something changed in the family situation. They need to move across country. And you don't think about, your Medicaid. You don't write a check for it every month. There's really nothing to do other than your regular enrollment activities. So you move to the other state, you sign up for that state's Medicaid. Currently, the states do not have a ready-made system where we communicate directly with the other states, because there's all types of PHI concerns over the privacy of the health data and so forth. There is a very limited federal program called the Paris Match. I don't remember the acronym, I apologize, but it's a federal program run by the Department of Treasury, where they have the states upload all of the states' data on their beneficiaries. And they do a very rudimentary match to say, hey, Texas, you've got a Steve Johnson here with this date of birth and this social, and Illinois has a Steve Johnson with the same date of birth and social. You guys probably ought to check that out. We do have the benefit of that information now, although it's not being utilized to the extent that perhaps it should be. What would be better, though, is the other thing that the federal government gets, that CMS gets, is something called the TMSIS data, also an acronym I'm not familiar with because it's federal. But every state sends all of the claims data on a regular basis to the federal government, and they put all that inside a giant computer, and they can look at it. So if I'm trying to figure out whether Steve Johnson's in Illinois or in Texas, what would really benefit me to know is where is he using his medical benefits, because that data can provide that. HHS-OIG, federal HHS-OIG, actually had a review finding when they were looking at Texas saying, how come you guys don't make CMS use this data in a way that would be more beneficial to you, which of course I say somewhat in jest because we don't have any authority over CMS. But we did write them and specifically asked them, will you use the TMSIS data to give us much better interstate matches? And they said, we'll think about it. And so that would be something the federal government could do. There's another very simple thing. I was thinking we might get the question when we talked about laying out the 10 or 15 SNAP cards at Costco or Sam's, that really kind of hurt my feelings. I thought, well, why would Costco or Sam's say this doesn't sound right? They are prohibited from doing anything at that point by federal law as a vendor in the SNAP program because again, it's okay for me to give Ray, he's my roommate, my SNAP card and say, Ray, my legs are broken. Would you go to Costco and pick up some eggs for us? And that's okay. The SNAP program allows that. You don't ID somebody for SNAP, but that rule or that convenience of having somebody else use your SNAP has been taken to an extreme now, to where you can go in there with 25 different people's SNAP cards with different people's names on them, and they can't say anything about it. I do want to point out, though, that Sam's and Costco specifically have been wonderful partners with the OIG. They can't challenge the individual's right to make that purchase, but they certainly take every scrap of videotape, documents, receipts, and the client data and provide that in a form of a referral to us. And we've had many successful felony prosecution investigations based upon their cooperation. But it's a shame that, again, it's much better to catch the cows while they're in the barn than it is to, once that person leaves in the car, if they don't come back to that store, or if we can't find an address for them, then they got away with it. So that to me seems like a fairly simple change in the federal regulation or process that could be done.
I would just like to build on Steve's first one. It would be great to get the additional data, but it would also be great to be able to more easily share information between states. Right now, if you're doing a criminal case, there's some exceptions in HIPAA, but not if you're doing an administrative case. And so to be able to say, Illinois, has Steve been to the doctor? Have you processed claims for him for the last 6 months? And if they can say yes, and I haven't processed any claims in Texas for the last 6 months, there's a high likelihood Steve no longer lives in Texas and now he lives in Illinois. And that makes it easier for me to unenroll him here and not have to expend a lot of manpower to research one case. So
That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. No, thank you for being here today. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so that concludes today's testimony on waste, fraud, and abuse.